Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Our guest today holds a PhD in psychology, is a consultant to the Australian Defence Force, and has more than 30 years of experience influencing the culture and mindset of high performers. Today, she's going to show you how to stop self-sabotage by recognizing behaviours and replacing them with positive and helpful habits. Please put your hands together and help us welcome to the Mental Detox podcast our good friend, Dr. Jo Lukins. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
It's always a pleasure. Now, what I've learned very recently is that your latest book has been forwarded by one of Australia's top footballers. Now, you've been the sports psychologist for the North Queensland Cowboys for more than 25 years. And Jonathan Thurston, undoubtedly one of the top players in Australia, wrote the foreword for your book.
Yes, it was wonderful of him to do that for me. So I very much appreciate it.
What an honour to be able to do that. So you've recently released the book. Can we get a quick insight into your book?
Yeah, so the book that I wrote was based on the experience that I've had working within elite sport. I've worked with a number of teams over the years and also worked in university teaching sports psychology. So what I aimed to do with the book was to do something that was a little less academic and a little bit more conversational. And it was essentially taking what I've found to be some of the key lessons that I've learned from working with athletes, and also what helps athletes to be successful. And then I've converted that into a way that any of us can take on board some of those lessons and apply them in our own lives. So I guess the messaging from it is that you don't have to be an elite athlete to think like one. And so it's just sharing some of those messages and insights about, how to achieve and what performance can look like for any of us.
These are elite athletes. They must have no limitations whatsoever. They must have been born out of the breath of the gods, born with the silver spoon, and they would have never had to do any hard work, and they would have never had a self-sabotaging behaviour in their life. It would not be possible.
Oh, if only that was the case, if only you could be born that way. But what most of our elite athletes know is, as you're suggesting there, is it comes from a lot of hard work. It's a lot of preparation. It's about what they're ready to do on the day, and it's the little things that they do in the background, the things that we never see, that continue to contribute to their success. Which is often many years down the track from when they first began.
Are they human?
Yes, definitely very human, very human. They all are.
I was an athlete for many years, going on to become an Australian champion athlete, a 3-time state champion athlete. And I would say the voices in my head must have been louder than all of my friends, because sometimes it just drowned out everything around me. And I know those little voices become loud and they end up self-sabotaging just the little things. So with athletes and with high performers, what are the small things that they do to self-sabotage? What do you see after 30 years in the field?
Well, as you said, athletes are human too. So it is the little things. And I think sometimes we get caught up in the big things, but it's the little things that make a really big difference. So whether it be from hitting the snooze button half a dozen times in the morning when we're getting up and having that conversation with ourselves. I often say to people, I think the toughest distance that we travel every single day is from mattress to floor. And once you've achieved that, then you're usually doing quite well. So it's the small behaviours that you need to do for success. It's the hydrating well. It's the knowing what your vulnerabilities are late in the afternoon when perhaps you're feeling a bit fatigued. So it's really understanding yourself and knowing the little things that you can do that can make a big difference. And then, those things will build and help you to achieve at your best.
These little sabotages that people do, how can they start to identify these limiting behaviours that you talk about?
Well, I think the first thing comes from self-awareness. So if we don't pay attention to ourselves, if we're not mindful about, as you said, you talked about that, the voices in your head, and the voices are supposed to be in our head. But it's, that's our commentary on the world. So how we understand the world is how we talk to ourselves. And what we do know, particularly from the field of positive psychology, is that the way that you think matters. The way you choose to speak to yourself makes a considerable difference, because, you know, if you encounter a situation, let's say you would encounter some sort of adversity, that conversation that is then elicited is crucial, because depending upon what you say to yourself depends then on how you feel, and then that then leads into what you then do and behave. So if I was to come home at the end of a long day and tell myself how fatigued I was and tired and so forth, then the couch suddenly becomes very attractive, as does the TV remote and probably the packet of chocolate biscuits in the pantry. Whereas if I can come home at the end of a long day, acknowledge that I'm tired, but also remind myself how much better I'm going to feel after I've gone for a walk, or I've, you know, gone out for a swim, or I've done something for myself, then I'm much more likely then to come back in, make a healthy dinner and so forth. So it's that combination of the way that we speak to ourselves and also our actions as well. So, you know, we can speak to ourselves in a way that's helpful, or we can, as you say, self-sabotage, which is our focus for today, in little ways that can make a big difference.
Well, I know where the chocolate bickies are going. we were in the office last night, and we were talking about Nini's explanatory style. And there was a challenge that she came up against, and we're talking about it's the way that you're explaining it to yourself. And we could see that the avoidance behavior started to kick in. So what was happening for you yesterday?
I just about to launch my coaching business, but at the end, I think I kind of comparing myself to my husband, because he's really, really good. So I start having these little noises
double
in my
her salary.
Yeah, in my brain that, you know, oh, can I do as good as my husband? You know, what if blah, 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 blah? What if I didn't do it as good as him? What will happen? So I really can resonate what you're saying, that, you know, self-awareness, you know, I have that. I know. I realize that the little noises start kicking in. And that's why I feel, hey, I think I should talk to Daniel about this. Yeah.
And that's great. And I think, Nini, what's really important with that, as you said, is you notice that was happening. Because it's interesting, isn't it? Just because we think something doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, that maybe the self-doubt that you had there is part of the anticipation and excitement of the launch, which is fantastic. Yeah. Congratulations on that.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting, if I can pick up on, say, just one of the comments that you made there where you said, what if I'm not as good? So let's go with that one. Yeah. Well, what if it's not as good? I don't know if that matters, you know. So it's sometimes we can get caught up in that conversation with ourselves, and when you actually kind of really look at it, you know, then it doesn't matter. And we do know that social comparison is one of those things that we all as humans do it all the time. And sometimes it can be helpful, sometimes it can be a benchmark, and sometimes it really does get in the way of us progressing. So sometimes we need to do something anyway, you know, and take that risk, because if you didn't take that risk, think of all those people that wouldn't get the benefit of being involved with your coaching program. So, and I'm sure it's fantastic.
Thank you.
I've found fascinating over the years following that stream of consciousness. So you catch that first thought, but sometimes you don't regulate it and you don't do anything about it. And all of a sudden it's, I haven't made a phone call and I should get back to that person, to all of a sudden the client never calls back. They start to spread rumors about you. The phone stops, the internet stops working, the business collapses, and all of a sudden you're living on the street, and that stream of consciousness can just take over. And those feelings kick in, and that mood really starts to shift. And then you get stuck in a mood. And I've seen this with people. They can be in a mood for an hour, a week, a month. And there's people who have been in these moods for a lifetime, and they haven't caught that first thought, and they haven't been able to stop that stream of consciousness that follows.
And I think one of the points that you highlight there, Daniel, which is so important for all of us to think about, is that mood is contagious. So it's also about the people you choose to spend your time with as well. And exactly as you said, that if we don't pay attention to what's going on, we can create a self-fulfilling prophecy where, exactly as you said, from one small thing that we didn't do all the way through to, you know, business catastrophic results kind of thing, as you talked about there. And it can happen in reverse as well. That and I think that's why it's so useful to start with the small behaviours, because, you know, the feeling of well-being that comes from doing the little things right, even though they're maybe not necessarily wahoo moments, and you don't need to share them on social media or any of those sorts of things. In fact, I'd urge that you don't. you know, what they do is they bring a sense of self-satisfaction. It's really reinforcing for us when we do the little things well, and then it becomes easier to tackle the bigger projects in our lives.
Do you think maybe as an Australian society, do we celebrate the small wins enough, or do we overlook them?
No, we don't. I don't think we celebrate the small wins enough, and I don't think we spend enough time recognizing why we've been successful. That I even see that sometimes, you know, across, you know, worked with lots of sporting teams over the years. And if you follow any team in on a Monday morning after their weekend's game, and if they've won, it's usually a very short discussion that what they're doing is celebrating the success rather than actually looking at what did we do well because we won, you know, and that's worthy of attention because you want to repeat it. But what tends to happen is we tend to go, oh my goodness, we lost on the weekend, you know, and the meeting is twice as long. So we do, as humans, often tend to have that kind of a tendency to be biased towards the negative. We pay more attention to it. We put more weight on it. And we don't spend enough time celebrating our successes and noticing the little things that we do well.
We've done a lot of travel around the world. We were formerly cabin crew. And one thing that always stood out to me was that we build monuments to our disasters. We build monuments to our failures. And from Africa through to Europe, through America, through Australia, there's these ginormous monuments built. I was in the west coast of Africa in Senegal, and they had built a giant slave man, and he must have been about 5 or 6 stories high with his wife, who was a slave, and the child. And they'd built all these monuments to the pain, and they were celebrating the pain. But the wins that they had in the freedom, there was no monuments to the freedom. And it was like a constant reminder around the world, hey, there's a lot of pain, and, you know, think about all the bad things. We do this and we see it. And those pains people talk about, and it's like in the media we say, if it bleeds, it leads. You know, if you talk about pain in the media, people start to buy it. You put painful events and put fear into people on the television, they start to buy different things.
That's right. And you're so right, because people do buy into negativity. I think the last figure I saw, and I know it varies, but it's something around 17-1 is the ratio of the negative news stories versus the positive ones. You know, I often say, if you want to see a good news story, then hang out for the bit between the sport and the weather when they show, you know, cat getting rescued out of a tree that we do. And I actually, and that being said, I do sometimes use that as a discussion point, often with my poor children, where I might say to them, if something has befallen them, you know, we often have that conversation about, well, is it going to be on the 6 o'clock news? Because our expectation is that the 6 o'clock news, unfortunately, is often full of, you know, sad events, negative events, the disasters and so forth. And it would be nice if we spent more time noticing the good. And that would certainly be good for us as individuals, but also in our organisations, in our teams, and certainly in our communities as well.
Yeah.
A little thought just popped into my mind. It's interesting you mentioned the 6 o'clock news. It's like a Pavlovian response. Everybody, 6 o'clock hits, the news channel starts, feel bad at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, unfortunately, unless it was the grand final weekend and your team won, then you probably are. If you know, for those that choose to watch the news tonight, watch the first 4 or 5 stories. I don't yet know what they're going to be, but there's a good chance there's a strong flavour there of the negativity. And you often find sometimes people might go on a holiday and then opt not to watch the news for a while, and you know, and feel probably better after they've done it. So, and again, it's not about not watching the news. What it is about being a consumer that knows, again, it's what we're talking about, self-sabotage. Notice the effect that your behaviour and your thoughts are having on you. And if you know that you're watching a lot of negativity in the news, know that, you know, at some point you might need to step away from it and do something that feels good for you, or to notice the good, so that you can sort of counterbalance some of that negativity that we get in our lives.
So for our friends and followers who are watching this, there's no doubt that they're self-sabotaging. They're doing something that's getting in their own way. In your opinion, what are some of the fastest ways to stop self-sabotage?
Well, after you've noticed that it's happening, is to work out for yourself then what is the alternate response. So if I can give it to you in the context of a very simple example that I see often. So if someone offers you a compliment, so perhaps you've cooked them a meal, or you've done something for them at work, or you've helped them out with something, and someone says to you, thanks for helping me out with that, I really appreciate it. it's really common for people to then go, oh no, it was nothing, or I didn't know, the dinner wasn't that nice, or whatever. We have this tendency to respond to the compliment with a negative response. And of course, what that does is it not only downplays our own efforts, but it's also kind of a little bit, I think, rude to the person who's offered you the compliment. So as a way of a small example there, you know, and I would suggest this maybe for everyone who's listening, myself included, is to remind yourself that when someone pays you a compliment, then say thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, yes, the dinner could have been different, or whatever it is, you could have done things differently. But if someone is generous enough to offer you a compliment, say thank you. Now it's a really small thing, but it's a big thing, because if you're someone who gets caught up in the negative self-talk, if you're constantly, you know, challenging yourself and questioning yourself and doubting yourself, accepting a compliment is a very small step towards starting to build your confidence. So it's a small strategy, but it's a good example, I think, of doing something little well.
Do you think that is also coming from the self-worth as well? You know, doesn't like to take the compliment, as you say, you know, no, it's okay, it's nothing.
Yes, I do. I do think it can be about that. And I think that, you know, our self-esteem is so central to who we are and what we do. But if we want to look at, you know, the habits of success, and if we want to look at ways that we can look after ourselves and not self-sabotage ourselves, one of the things is if someone is generous enough to offer you a compliment, why not be generous enough to say thank you for it?
Yeah, 100%.
One of our clients in the UK, a very successful guy, and I love what he says. It says two things. First one, he says, how can a guy with no brain earn more than a brain surgeon? That's the first thing I love about him. The second thing that I love about him, he says it's rude to turn away a gift. And when he talks about this, he's not talking about physical gifts. He's talking about the gifts of a compliment. And if somebody says thank you, he says you should enjoy that compliment.
Yes, absolutely. It's been offered to you. And when you think about it from the perspective of what it might feel like for the person who offered the compliment to then have it sort of almost thrown back at them, that can be enough for a lot of people just to want to do that anyway, because most people don't intend to be rude or ungrateful, which is how that can sometimes come across.
Now, in your new book, in chapter 3, you talk about success on autopilot. And in chapter 3, you talk about habit formation. What insights can you share with us about habit formation?
Well, habit formation is great as a strategy for overcoming self-sabotage. There's a range of things that we can look at, but I really like looking at habits because it's really in that mindset of how can I behave my way towards success. That, you know, success is about the way we think, and it's also about the things that we do. So there's lots of little things that we can do in terms of our habits. So most humans make, and it's no wonder we're tired by the end of each day, make about 30 to 40,000 decisions every single day. Wow. Now, often we don't notice ourselves making those decisions because we're doing them all the time. So if I took a really small behavior that hopefully we all do every day, which is something like brushing our teeth. Now, brushing your teeth involves a whole range of decisions and steps. When in the day you're going to do it, where you're going to stand when you do it, you know, even down to the complexities of do you put the paste on from left to right or right to left. You know, all these sorts of things that I'm guessing most people listening in didn't think about that this morning. I know I certainly didn't. So what our brain does is to compensate for the number of decisions that we're making is it condenses things down into chunks, and particularly for something like brushing your teeth, for most of us that's a habit. So chances are most people will brush their teeth at the same particular point in time in the routine of their day. So say, for example, for me, it might be, it's the last thing I do just before I walk out the door in the morning. So I might brush my teeth. So we condense all of these things down. Now, brushing your teeth or putting on your seatbelt, those sorts of behaviours, we don't have to think about them because they're habits. And so I always say to people, habits are great because they save us from having to think. I also say that habits are terrible because they save us from having to think. It's really about whether, and the lens I always like is not whether the habits are good or bad, but whether the habits are helpful or unhelpful. Brushing your teeth is helpful, wearing a seatbelt is helpful, eating 4 packets of chocolate biscuits in the afternoon is probably less helpful. So, but that could easily be a habit of mine as well. So one of the things that I challenge people to do, and we particularly talk about it, as you mentioned, thank you for that, in chapter 3 of the book, is how can you in the midst of a busy day, when you've got lots and lots of decisions happening, how can you now add something new in? So, you know, how can you say, if we extended on the brush the teeth, the example I give in the book is about flossing your teeth. Because flossing your teeth, unfortunately, is one of those things that most people don't do. That we find that, you know, about 11% of the population will actually brush their teeth according to what is particularly recommended. So, you know, sometimes it's about just noticing that there's a behaviour that we want to change, and then working out, you know, what will the new behaviour look like? And because humans tend to think in what we call contingencies, which is when and then. So when I'm in this situation, then I do it. When I get into my car, then I put on my seatbelt. I don't need to think about that because I've done it so many times. So what I can do is, if I want to implement a new decision, then what I can do is think about what that behaviour is going to be, and ideally put it into the context of the when then. I used that as an example with you just before when it came to the compliment. So what I said was, when someone offers you a compliment, then you say thank you. And interestingly, me just even suggesting that to you as an idea, I'm giving away the secret now, but me suggesting that to you as an idea increases the likelihood that you're going to change that behaviour, that you're actually going to do it by 2 to 3 times. And we find that consistently across behaviour change, that phrasing of when and then tells me what I'm going to do. And it triggers a response for us in the brain that helps increase that behaviour.
Okay, we're back.
You're back.
We're here. Okay.
Now, I kept talking, so I'm really hoping people heard that. But if not, I'm very happy to repeat it again, or to provide it in another way.
We were talking about brushing the teeth, and then we were talking about the positive habits, you know, brushing your teeth, yes, putting on your seatbelt, and then habits that aren't so positive, which could be eating 4 packets of biscuits. And that's about where we stopped. So let's continue from there.
Right. Okay. So I didn't continue. Okay. So I'll keep going with that then. So what I gave was the example of, so what we know is brushing your teeth, putting on a seatbelt are the things that, up until I just mentioned it before, you've probably done it, some of those things many times today, particularly if you've been driving in your car, you don't think about it. But maybe you haven't given as much thought, or maybe you didn't actually this morning floss your teeth. And if you didn't floss your teeth, then you are normal, because you're like the majority of the population who don't do that. About 11% of the population floss their teeth according to the guidelines by dentists. So, and if you do floss your teeth, then you're an overachiever. And if I could see everyone listening, yeah, that's right. And if I could see the audience now, you'd know who hadn't, because they'd be currently running their tongue over their teeth. And unfortunately, so the example I gave is, though, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because most people know that that's a helpful behaviour, it's good for our health, and we want to do it, and we don't. So that might be a good example of a behaviour that you might want to adopt for yourself. So the way that you would do it is, it's about anchoring the behaviour to something that's already happening. The logical thing in this case is brushing your teeth. So what you would say to yourself, and it's the words that matter, it's what we call in psychology is, it's a contingency response. When this happens, then this happens. So when I have a toothbrush in my hand, then I reach for the dental floss. And what happens is, just by simply saying it and actually wanting to do the behaviour, I instantly increase the likelihood of flossing my teeth by 2 to 3 times. So yeah, introducing a new habit, it's simply about that. So if I give another example, which was with a basketball player that I worked with several years ago, who set themselves the goal of increasing their shooting percentage, which is a great goal for a nationally ranked basketball player. And they said, look, the way I want to do it is I want to shoot 100 extra baskets after practice every training session for the season. And then that will increase my shooting percentage. So that's a great goal. And they said, yeah, but the problem is, Joe, I go home and I forget. Like, because I'm in my routine, and let's think about that, I'm in my habits, I'm self-sabotaging myself, if we want to use that terminology, because I just go home and I forget to do it. So what we realised is that the last thing the player would do, as they cleaned out their locker at the end of the training session, is they would grab their keys and go home. So I didn't explain any of the background of this to the athlete, because I knew they wanted to do it. So all I said to them was, okay, so when your keys are in your hand, then ask yourself if you've taken the shots. So what I did was I took a behaviour, a habit that was always happening, having the keys in the hand, And I anchored it with the new behavior. Because the reality is, in the busyness of our days, so much going on, we don't necessarily have a lot of space in our heads to remember the new novel behaviors, the new habits that we're wanting to introduce. So for that athlete, they went from never taking the 100 shots after practice to doing it every single time, simply because the keys became the trigger for the new behavior they wanted to introduce. So I've got someone else that I worked with recently, and they're a teacher, and they wanted to increase their hydration. They wanted to drink more water. So what they said is, when the bell rings, then I'll drink more water. So it was almost a very Pavlovian thing to do.
No eating steaks.
No eating steaks and no bowls of food. But what it did is that the bell became a trigger. Now, it doesn't mean that they drank water every single time the bell rang, but what it meant was they thought about it. And that's sometimes what it is. If you genuinely want to change a behavior, then thinking of it in terms of, when I'm in this situation, then I'm going to do this, will increase the likelihood of behavior change by 2 to 3 times.
It's so true. I've been singing a song to my daughter for probably 7 years.
Yep.
And what's the song again? How does it go?
Why nobody not cuddling him for? And soon she heard that, she will just automatically like cuddle.
Without even thinking, I'll sing the song. Why nobody not cuddling him for? And she'll run over whatever she's doing and she'll cuddle.
Yeah.
And we've seen these little things and those patterns be ingrained. Those positive, well, for me, it's a positive habit because I get a cuddle from my 7-year-old.
That's a wonderful habit. And that's it. Humans work on contingencies, you know. We see students in schools. I'm based in Queensland, so we have a no hat, no play policy at schools. So, you know, primary school kids will walk outside and straight away put a hat on their head. You know, they don't have to be, well, they have to be told as preppies, but by grade 6, they don't even think about it. Because they work off the contingency. When I go outside, then I put on a hat. And I gave the example before, you know, when I have a toothbrush in my hand, then I reach for the dental floss. And what that means is that for everyone who's heard this podcast, it increases the likelihood that when you next go to brush your teeth, you know, hello, I'm going to be there. Now, the reality is that, you know, whether or not you choose to floss is completely up to you. You know, it will be a reflection of how important that is for you. But sometimes all we need when we have a good intention is the trigger, you know, and you can use this strategy for anything. So if it's about getting up in the morning as soon as the alarm goes off, it's when the alarm goes off, then I get up, you know, which is much more definite a language. And then it's, you know, and it might reflect what time you went to bed and so forth. But it might also be, I've had people very successfully set the alarm clock to go to bed. So because, you know, people often tell me, you know, when our willpower is a little bit lower at the end of the evening, it's much easier to lie on the couch and watch one more episode of whatever you've been binge watching on TV than it is to get up, turn off all the lights and get yourself ready for bed. So even something as simple as setting the alarm clock on your phone, and if that appeals to someone, they could do it now while they're sitting listening to this. If you set the alarm clock at, I don't know, I'll make it up, 10 p.m., then, you know, the alarm goes off. When the alarm goes off, then I go to bed. So you get yourself ready, you go to bed, and then, you know, you're instantly making better choices, and it just becomes an automatic behaviour then.
Well, I think a good choice that people should do right now, whilst they're setting that time on their phone to go to sleep, is to also type in your website and head over and get your new book. So what's the best place for our followers and friends to find you online? Where's the best place to go?
Well, probably the easiest place is my website. So thank you for that. And if you can remember my name, you'll find my website. So it's drjolukins.com. So drjolukins.com. And over there are copies of my book. So there's the paperback, there's the audio, and there's the ebook. So depending on your preferred flavour of consumption for books, they're all there. So you can find those there. And also available, obviously, through all the normal online channels as well if you want to buy through one of those. But you can get it directly from me if you like, and I'll sign it for you.
Yes, do that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been joined by Dr. Jo Lukins today, one of Australia's top psychologists with more than 30 years in the field. And be sure to head over to her website right now, join the conversation here on Facebook, and also add Dr. Joe there on LinkedIn. So Dr. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm going to make sure that my wife flosses her teeth.
I should remind you, okay?
And stop eating my chocolate bickies. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Our pleasure.